There is a sound that stays with you long after you hear it. Not a crash. Not a scream. Just silence. The particular kind of silence that falls over a room when a man realizes that the one person he trusted completely has been looking him in the eye every single day and choosing, deliberately and carefully, to destroy him. That is the silence that fell over Carter Weston on a Saturday afternoon in March of 2021, when he sat alone in his home office, read the last page of a private investigator's report, and understood that the baby sleeping upstairs, the child he had wept over, named, assembled a crib for, told his mother about in a phone call that made her cry for 10 minutes, that child had not come from his wife. He had come from a young woman Carter had never met, who had signed documents she did not fully understand, who had been told things that were not true, who was at that very moment sitting alone in a single-room apartment grieving a loss that had been engineered entirely by the woman Carter had married. And the only reason he was sitting in that office knowing any of this, the only reason the truth had found him at all, was because a 23-year-old hospital housekeeper with shaking hands and a torn backpack strap had chosen, at great personal cost, to walk down a corridor and tell him what she knew. This is that story. All of it. And I need you to stay with me until the very end, because the part that will change the way you think about love and truth and courage is not the betrayal. It is what happened after. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to hear from you. And if you are new here, click the subscribe button right now so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. We put out stories like this one regularly, and you do not want to miss what is coming next. Carter Weston grew up in a house that was too small for the amount of living that happened inside it. He was the youngest of 4 brothers, raised in a neighborhood in Savannah, Georgia, where the lawns were modest and the screen doors never fully latched, and where his father left for work before sunrise 6 days a week without complaint. His mother ran that household the way a conductor runs an orchestra, with complete authority and no baton. Dinner was on the table every evening at 6:30. Church was non-negotiable. Arguing was allowed, but cruelty was not. There was not much money, but there was an abundance of something harder to name, a sense that the people in that house were genuinely glad to be in it together. Carter carried that feeling with him when he left at 18. He has carried it every day since. By the time he was 42, Carter Weston had built a real estate investment firm that had left a visible mark on 3 different city skylines. He had started with a single undervalued property in Savannah bought with money he had saved and borrowed and scraped together over 5 years of working jobs that had nothing to do with real estate. He had taught himself everything. He had made mistakes that cost him significantly and had absorbed every one of them without self-pity. He had eventually landed in Atlanta, where the market rewarded the kind of patient, precise thinking that Carter had spent his 20s developing, and by his mid-30s he was the kind of name that appeared regularly in the business sections of regional papers and occasionally in national ones. He was respected in the particular way that self-made people earn respect, not through charm, though he had some, but through a reputation for doing exactly what he said he would do, every single time, without exception. He lived in a large home in Buckhead behind iron gates and old oak trees. He drove the same car for 6 years before replacing it. He wore dark coats year-round. He was not flashy about any of it, which was itself a kind of statement in the circles he moved through. He had more money than he knew how to spend meaningfully and a life that looked, from any reasonable external vantage point, like the fulfillment of the American dream in its most complete form. And he was, in a way that he rarely spoke about directly but that everyone who knew him well could see, quietly and persistently lonely in the one place that mattered most. He wanted a family. Not the abstract concept of one. The actual, specific, noisy, imperfect, daily reality of one. He wanted what he had grown up inside. He had wanted it for years and had not been able to find it. And that want, that one unmet hunger in an otherwise full life, was the crack through which everything that follows entered. He had been married once before, briefly, in his early 30s. She was a woman he had genuinely cared for, an architect named Rosalind who was brilliant and driven and ultimately wanted a life that looked nothing like the one Carter was building. The divorce was civil and sad in the way that endings are when nobody did anything particularly wrong. They simply wanted different things. There were no children. Carter had wanted them even then. Rosalind had not. It was one of the central things that finally separated them. By the time that marriage ended, Carter was 34 years old and already privately aware that the thing he wanted most was going to require him to be more patient than he had ever had to be in business. His family worried about him in the careful, sideways way that Southern families do. His mother called regularly and always managed to mention, within the first 5 minutes, some cousin or neighbor's child who had recently gotten married or had a baby. His brothers teased him with the specific cruelty of siblings who love you. Carter absorbed all of it and said little. He dated occasionally and without much investment. He worked. He waited. He was, by the time Diane Harlow appeared in his life, a man who had nearly convinced himself that the thing he wanted most might simply not be for him. She arrived in his life at a charity gala in April of 2017. These things are worth slowing down for, because the way Diane entered a room tells you a great deal about who she was. She was 37 years old, and she had the composed, deliberate beauty of a woman who has spent years refining the impression she makes. Not beautiful in a way that announced itself immediately, beautiful in a way that you noticed gradually, and then couldn't stop noticing. She wore a dark dress and a single strand of pearls and moved through the room at the event with a sureness that suggested she had never once in her adult life walked into a space and wondered whether she belonged there. She ran a small but well-regarded interior design business and had built, through careful social cultivation over a decade, a network of clients and contacts that placed her comfortably within Atlanta's old money circles despite the fact that her own background was decidedly not old money. She had worked for every inch of the position she occupied. She simply made it look effortless, which is its own kind of skill. Carter noticed her because she said something funny and precise about the centerpiece on the table nearest to where he was standing, something about the flowers being arranged with the confidence of someone who had never actually looked at flowers, and he laughed in a way that surprised him. They talked for 2 hours that night. She knew things. She asked real questions. She was genuinely entertaining. And she looked at Carter with a quality of attention that men of his type rarely receive, the sense that she was truly interested in what he was saying rather than in what he represented. He left the event with her phone number and the first real feeling of anticipation about another person he had experienced in years. What Carter did not know then, and what he would not know for 4 more years, was that Diane Harlow had done her research before that gala. She had known Carter Weston would be in the room. She had known, from sources she had carefully cultivated in the business community, the broad outlines of who he was and what he wanted. She had positioned herself. The funny remark about the flowers had been prepared. The 2 hours of conversation had been, on her side, a performance of such skill and naturalness that even in retrospect it is difficult to call it entirely cynical. Diane was not a simple person. She was not a cartoon villain. She was a complicated woman who had learned, through a childhood and early adulthood that had asked a great deal of her, that the world did not give things to people like her freely. You took what you needed. You constructed what you wanted. You protected it with everything you had. The relationship moved quickly. Within 6 months they were seeing each other exclusively. Within a year she had moved into the Buckhead house, which she immediately began refining in ways that Carter found both impressive and slightly amusing, as though the house had been waiting for someone to take it seriously. Within 18 months they were engaged. Carter proposed on a quiet evening at home, not at a restaurant, not in a grand gesture, just the two of them and a ring and the kind of conversation that felt like the closing of something that had been long open. Diane said yes without hesitation. She cried. He believed the tears. They may have been real. Even Diane, looking back years later, might have struggled to separate what was genuine from what was strategic. Carter's mother flew in from Savannah for the engagement dinner. She was a woman in her early 70s with sharp eyes and a kind of warmth that takes years to earn, and she had regarded each of Carter's previous relationships with a polite reserve that everyone present could feel. That evening, Diane reached across the dinner table and took the older woman's hand and said something quiet to her, something Carter could not hear from his seat, and his mother's expression shifted in a way he had not seen before. She looked at Diane and then at her son, and she smiled the smile of a woman who has finally gotten the thing she has been praying for. Carter felt something open in his chest. He was, in that moment, more purely happy than he had been in a decade. He did not know, sitting at that dinner table watching his mother smile, that Diane was already aware of the things she had kept hidden from every serious relationship she had entered since the age of 30. Years earlier, she had undergone a procedure that had permanently ended her ability to conceive a child. It had been her choice, made freely in a chapter of her life when a child was the last thing she wanted or could manage. It was a medical fact about her body. It was also a fact she had decided, with complete deliberateness, never to disclose to Carter Weston, because Carter Weston wanted a child more than he had ever wanted anything, and Diane had understood from the earliest weeks of their relationship, that this was the one thing she could not give him honestly. And Diane Harlow had never, not once in her adult life, been willing to accept losing something she had decided she deserved to keep. So she began to plan. There are real-world cases, documented and prosecuted in American courts, of women who have faked pregnancies using prosthetic devices, forged medical documentation, and fraudulent ultrasound images. These cases are not common, but they exist, and they follow a pattern that mental health professionals who study them have described as the result of extreme fear of abandonment combined with an extraordinary capacity for sustained deception. The women in these cases are not all the same. Some are mentally ill. Some are desperate. Some are, like Diane Harlow, simply and terrifyingly rational. They have decided that they want something they cannot have honestly, and they have decided to obtain it by other means, and they have brought to that project the same intelligence and discipline that, directed differently, might have made them remarkable. Diane spent the months before her announcement preparing with a thoroughness that, when the full scope of it was eventually uncovered, left Carter's investigator visibly shaken despite years of professional experience. She obtained, through a website that sold novelty pregnancy documentation, an ultrasound image that could pass a casual inspection. She located and paid a physician operating a small private practice 2 hours outside Atlanta to create a pregnancy file under her name and provide written confirmation of a pregnancy. She ordered, from a specialized online retailer that served theatrical and film production clients, a series of prosthetic pregnancy forms designed to be worn under clothing and adjusted incrementally over months to simulate the progression of a growing pregnancy. She researched every stage of pregnancy in clinical detail, the symptoms by week, the physical changes, the emotional shifts, the specific discomforts and cravings and sleep disruptions that she would need to perform convincingly for the next 9 months. She watched documentaries. She read medical literature. She spent evenings in online forums for pregnant women, learning the texture of the experience from the inside so she could reproduce it from the outside. And she found Serena Okafor. This is the part of the story that requires the most care, because Serena is not a footnote. She is not a plot device. She is a person, and what happened to her is the deepest injustice in a story full of them. She was 21 years old, a nursing student at a state university an hour north of Atlanta, and she had become pregnant in the late summer of 2020 while in a relationship that had already, by the time she discovered the pregnancy, effectively ended. She was alone. She was financially unable to provide for a child. She was, in the particular way of young people facing impossible situations for the first time, terrified in ways she did not yet have language for. She had told almost no one. She had spent weeks cycling through options that all felt like versions of loss, and she had not yet found anything that felt like a way through. Diane found her through an intermediary, a person who operated in the space between legitimate private adoption and something far more troubling, someone who maintained informal contact with clinics, social workers, and individuals in Serena's situation and who, for a fee, connected people who had something to give with people who wanted to receive it outside of official channels. Diane approached Serena in September of 2020, in a diner not far from her university, dressed simply, speaking gently, presenting herself as one half of a couple who desperately wanted a child but had been unable to have one naturally. She said her husband knew about the arrangement and had agreed to it. She said the baby would go to a stable, loving, financially secure home. She said all the costs would be covered, that Serena would receive support, that the paperwork would be handled professionally, and that this was a way for Serena to give her child a life she herself could not yet provide. Serena listened. She asked questions. Diane answered all of them smoothly, because she had prepared for this conversation the way she had prepared for everything else, completely. Serena was not naive. She was simply young and frightened and exhausted and sitting across from a woman who seemed to have all the answers to the questions that had been keeping her awake for weeks. She signed. She believed she was doing the right thing. She had no way of knowing that the husband who had allegedly agreed to all of this had never been told that any of it existed. The pregnancy announcement happened on a Tuesday evening in October of 2020. Carter had had a long day and came home to find the dining room lit with candles, not a common occurrence, and a small wrapped box sitting at his place at the table. Diane was in the kitchen. She called to him to sit down. He loosened his tie and sat, looking at the box with the particular wariness of a man who is hoping very hard for something he does not want to let himself expect. Inside the box was a sonogram image. Printed, dated, with a physician's name in the header and a small arrow indicating the gestational measurement. Carter stared at it. He turned it over and looked at the back as though expecting more information. He looked up at Diane, who was standing in the kitchen doorway watching him with careful, steady eyes. He looked back at the image. He did not say anything for what felt like a very long time. Then his face did something it almost never did. It came completely apart. Not in a dramatic way. Just quietly, the controlled exterior he wore as naturally as his dark coat simply dissolving in a moment of feeling too large to manage. He stood up from the table. He crossed the room. He held his wife. "Are you happy?" she asked, quietly, into his shoulder. "I have never been this happy in my life," he said. He meant it completely, without qualification, without a single doubt. That is important to hold on to. Because what follows is not the story of a man who should have known better, or who was foolish, or who missed things he should have caught. It is the story of a man who loved someone and trusted them, which is what you are supposed to do. The weeks that followed were a blur of joy that Carter could barely contain and barely tried to. He called his mother, who cried for 10 minutes without interruption, pausing only to take breath. His business partner took him out to a restaurant that required a reservation 4 months in advance and ordered the most expensive bottle on the menu and made a toast that Carter would remember for the rest of his life. Carter began converting the guest room into a nursery, ordering furniture he had researched for weeks, spending his evenings watching assembly tutorials on his laptop and laughing at himself. This man who had negotiated $100 million deals and supervised the construction of buildings he could not have fit his Savannah childhood home inside, sitting cross-legged on the nursery floor with assembly instructions spread around him, unable to figure out 3 bolts and a plank of unfinished wood. Diane came to the doorway one evening and watched him, and she smiled, and the smile was complicated in a way that Carter did not register as complicated. He was too happy to register it as anything at all. She performed the pregnancy with flawless consistency. She placed her prenatal vitamins on the kitchen counter where Carter would see her take them every morning. She developed specific food aversions and mentioned them at meals. She complained of back pain with anatomical specificity, not just, "my back hurts," but, "it's the lower left side, the doctor said the baby is pressing on something." She adapted her clothing gradually as the padding beneath it required. She managed her medical appointments with complete control, choosing the private clinic on the outskirts of Atlanta where she had already made financial arrangements, attending most checkups with the explanation that she found it anxious-making to have Carter in the room, that she concentrated better alone, that she would describe everything to him afterward. He understood. He did not push. He trusted her. He asked once, gently, whether they should consider genetic testing, both because of their ages and because it was, medically, a reasonable thing to discuss. Diane deflected with a composure so complete that the deflection itself did not register as one. She cited concerns she had read about false positives causing unnecessary anxiety, mentioned that her physician had suggested they discuss it further at the next appointment, and changed the subject with the smooth inevitability of a river finding its way around a stone. Carter let it go. He had never in 4 years of marriage had a reason to second-guess her medical judgment about her own body. He did not begin now. Before we go any further into the mechanics of what Diane had set in motion, I need to stop and ask you something. Because I think it is easy, in a story like this one, to get so caught up in the drama of the wealthy and the powerful that we forget to look where the story is actually happening. And in this story, the most important thing that happens does not happen in the Buckhead house or the private clinic or any boardroom or courtroom. It happens in a corridor. In the hands of a young woman that almost nobody, in that world, ever thought to look at. Maya Collins was 23 years old in the fall of 2020. She had grown up in Morrow, a suburb south of Atlanta, in a house that was crowded and complicated in the way that houses become when money is always short and tension is always present. Her mother worked 2 jobs, a daytime shift in a school cafeteria and an evening shift cleaning offices in a downtown building, and did both without complaint and without much left over at the end of the day for the kind of conversations that Maya, as a teenager, had needed and rarely received. Her father was peripheral to her life in a way she had long since stopped describing as painful and simply accepted as fact. She had put herself through high school on discipline and stubbornness, graduated without fanfare, and enrolled in community college the following fall, taking 2 classes at a time because that was all she could afford alongside the work she needed to do to afford even that. She had been working at the private women's health clinic for 8 months by the time the relevant events began. She was on the housekeeping staff, cleaning rooms, restocking supplies, moving through the facility at the pace and in the manner that housekeeping staff everywhere move, which is to say quietly and without making eye contact and in a way that renders you, to most of the people around you, effectively invisible. This invisibility was not something Maya had chosen or curated. It was simply what happened when you wore a uniform and pushed a cart in a building full of people who were occupied with their own concerns and had long since stopped noticing the people who kept their environment clean. Maya was accustomed to it. It did not particularly bother her. She observed a great deal from inside that invisibility, as people who are routinely overlooked tend to do. In late October of 2020, on an evening shift that had been mostly unremarkable, Maya was restocking a supply cabinet in a corridor near the private consultation wing when she became aware of voices from behind a door that had not fully latched. She was not eavesdropping. She was doing her job, moving efficiently, not pausing. But the voices were close enough and the door was open enough and the tone of one of them was sharp enough that her hands slowed without her consciously deciding to slow them. She heard a woman's voice, composed and precise, giving instructions that were clinical in their flatness. She heard a man's voice, lower, responding with discomfort, using phrases like, outside normal protocols, and, what you're describing involves documentation I cannot legitimately provide. She heard the woman's voice again, steady and cold, saying that documentation was not his concern and that everything would be handled through proper channels, that his compensation had been agreed upon, and that the timeline needed to remain February. The door's latch caught. The voices became muffled. Maya stood very still for a moment, then continued down the corridor and finished her shift. She went home that night and lay awake for a long time trying to decide what she had heard. She knew she had not heard enough to be certain of anything. She also knew, with the particular instinct of someone who has spent years navigating environments where power is unevenly distributed, that the tone of that conversation had the texture of something wrong. She did not know how wrong. She told herself she might be overreacting. She went to work the next day and the day after that and said nothing to anyone, and tried, with moderate success, to put it out of her mind. She did not entirely succeed. The stone had been placed. It sat in her chest and did not dissolve. 3 months passed. January of 2021. Maya was working an early morning shift when she saw Serena Okafor for the second time. She had glimpsed her once before, briefly, in a corridor, a young woman, visibly pregnant, waiting outside one of the consultation rooms, looking at her phone with the focused blankness of someone trying not to think about where they were. Maya had not thought about it at the time. Young pregnant women in a women's health clinic were not unusual. But this morning, Serena was back, and she was further along, and she was alone in a way that was different from ordinary aloneness. There is a specific quality to the loneliness of a person who is doing something irrevocable and knows it and has decided to go through with it anyway. Maya, who had learned to read people in the way that invisible people learn to read them, saw it immediately. She watched Serena from a distance for a few minutes. Then she watched the woman who came to collect her from the waiting area. And Maya's chest went cold. It was the same composed, well-dressed woman whose voice she had heard through the unlatched door in October. The same precise posture. The same quality of controlled authority. She watched them disappear together down the corridor toward the consultation wing, and the stone in her chest, the one that had been sitting there for 3 months, shifted into something harder and less deniable. She understood now, or understood enough, the shape of what was being arranged. Not every detail. But enough to know that this young woman was being moved like a piece on a board by someone who knew the rules of a game the young woman had never agreed to play. Maya finished her shift. She went home. She sat at the small kitchen table in the apartment she shared with a rotating cast of roommates and thought for a very long time about what she was going to do. She knew what she stood to lose. The job she could not afford to lose. The references she needed for the future she was trying to build. The goodwill of people in a facility who would not hesitate, in her experience, to make her life extremely difficult if she caused them a problem. She knew that a cleaning woman from Moro with no credentials and no connections accusing wealthy, connected people of wrongdoing was not a situation that typically ended well for the cleaning woman. She had seen enough of the world to know that. She also knew that somewhere in this city, a young woman was about to hand over her child under false pretenses, and that somewhere else, a man was waiting to receive a baby he believed was his wife's, and that the whole construction had been built on lies that would eventually, in some form, find all of them. And she thought about that man she had never met. And she thought about that young woman she had watched disappear down a corridor alone. And she sat with it for 2 weeks before she made up her mind. The day Carter drove Diane to the clinic, it was raining. Not heavily, a thin, gray February rain that made the city look subdued and private. Carter held an umbrella over Diane at the entrance and felt a surge of something he could not name precisely, a combination of love and anticipation and an overwhelming awareness of the significance of the next several hours. He squeezed her hand in the elevator. She looked straight ahead. He assumed she was concentrating. He assumed she was nervous. He put his arm around her shoulders and told her quietly that she was going to be amazing. She nodded without speaking. In the clinic's family lounge, Carter sat with a coffee that went cold over the first half hour. He sent texts to his mother. He sent a text to his business partner that said only, "Today is the day," and received back a string of celebratory responses that made him smile at his phone like a teenager. He tried to read a magazine and found he could not hold a single sentence in his mind for more than a few seconds. He got up and paced the corridor and was gently redirected back to the lounge by a nurse who told him it could be several hours yet and that he would be called the moment it was time. He sat back down. He picked up the magazine again. He put it back down. He looked at the framed prints on the wall, generic pastorals, rolling hills, soft light, and thought about his father and wished for the 1,000th time that his father had lived long enough to see this. He did not know that Diane was not in a delivery room. He did not know that miles across Atlanta, in the maternity ward of a different hospital, Serena Okafor was in active labor, attended only by a woman Diane had hired specifically to be present on her behalf and to manage the transfer of paperwork. He did not know that the documents being processed in that ward contained his name, placed there without his knowledge or consent, constructing a legal fiction that would give him a child he had not known existed 2 days ago and erase, from the official record, the fact that a frightened 21-year-old woman had been the one to bring that child into the world. He did not know any of it. He was in a lounge reading a magazine he could not absorb, waiting to become a father. He had been waiting for 2 hours and 40 minutes when a nurse opened the door of the lounge and told him he could come in now. The room smelled of antiseptic and clean linen and something else, something warmer and harder to name, the smell of a beginning. Diane was in a bed. She was wearing a hospital gown. Her hair was slightly disheveled in a way that was entirely convincing. And she was holding a baby. A real baby. A boy with a full head of dark hair and eyes that were squinting against the light, and the smallest, most complete hands Carter had ever seen in his life. Diane looked up at Carter and held the baby out to him. Carter crossed the room in 3 steps and took his son with both arms, with the instinctive, terrified, deeply serious care of a person handling the most valuable thing they have ever been asked to hold, and he stood there, under the fluorescent lights of that clinical room, and wept. He wept quietly, with his face turned slightly down toward the baby, in the way of a man who does not usually cry and is not certain what to do with himself when he does. He said the name they had chosen, James, and the baby made a small, involuntary sound in response to the sound of that voice, and Carter laughed through the crying, and it was the laugh of a man who has arrived somewhere he has been trying to reach for his entire adult life. Diane watched him from the bed. Her expression was one that Carter would spend a long time afterward trying to understand. It was not joy. Joy is uncomplicated, spontaneous, involuntary. What was on Diane's face was something more controlled than that. It was the expression of a person who has executed an extremely complex plan successfully and is only now, in the aftermath, beginning to release the tension of it. It was relief. It was the exhalation of someone who has been holding their breath for months. Carter did not read it that way. He was holding his son. He was not reading anything at all. He was simply, completely, overwhelmingly present in the best moment of his life. If you are still watching at this point, drop a comment with the words, "I am still here." Let us see who is truly following this story, because what happens next is the part that changes everything. Maya Collins had not been scheduled to work the day Carter and Diane came to the clinic. She had traded a shift with a colleague 4 days earlier, not knowing specifically that this was the day, but knowing from what she had pieced together over the previous weeks that February was the month. The trade had not been entirely coincidental. She had been carrying the weight of what she knew for weeks, getting closer and then pulling back, talking herself into action and then out of it again, lying awake running through scenarios in which she said something and scenarios in which she did not. She had not yet made a final decision. She told herself she was just going to go in and see. She told herself she would know what to do when she got there. She was restocking a cart near the east corridor of the clinic's 2nd floor when she saw Carter Weston come out of the elevator. She recognized him. You did not live and work in Atlanta's professional circles, even on the periphery, without knowing his face from news photographs and business coverage. She watched him walk to the family lounge and sit down. She watched him take out his phone. She watched him pick up a magazine and put it back down. She watched him get up and pace and be redirected back to his seat. She watched all of this from the end of the corridor, her hands resting on the cart, her heart beating faster than it had any business beating. She thought about Serena Okafor, alone in a different hospital somewhere across the city. She thought about the conversation through the unlatched door. She thought about every reason she had accumulated over the past weeks not to do this. She thought about losing her job. She thought about what happened to people who made accusations against powerful, connected individuals. She thought about the torn strap of her backpack and the 2 classes she was paying for one at a time and the future she was building inch by inch, one careful step at a time, and how fragile all of it was and how easily it could be taken apart by one wrong move. Then she started walking. She walked down the corridor with her hands in front of her, not running, not hurrying, moving with the deliberate pace of someone who has made a decision and is executing it before the fear can catch up. She stopped a few feet from where Carter sat. He looked up. He had the slightly unfocused look of a man who has been waiting alone in a beige room for 2 hours and is not expecting anyone specific to appear. He looked at her work uniform and waited for whatever routine thing she was about to say to him. Maya's mouth was dry. Her hands were trembling in a way she could feel all the way up her forearms. She said, "Sir." And her voice came out smaller than she wanted, so she stopped and cleared her throat and tried again. "Sir, I need to tell you something and I don't know how to say it, so I'm just going to say it. I work here. I've worked here for a while. A few months ago I heard something I wasn't supposed to hear, and I've been thinking about it ever since, and I've been trying to decide whether to say something, and I've decided that I have to." Carter looked at her steadily. His expression did not change. He waited. "I think your wife has been arranging for someone else's baby to be presented as hers," Maya said. The words came out flat and direct because she had rehearsed them in her head so many times that the emotion had been stripped off. "I don't know everything. I don't have proof. But I know what I heard, and I know what I saw last month when I saw the other woman here, and I think you need to know that something is not right." Carter Weston looked at this young woman in the housekeeping uniform with her trembling hands and her careful words and the expression of someone bracing for impact, and he was quiet for a long moment. He was not dismissive. He did not call for security. He did not make a face that said, "Who do you think you are?" He looked at her the way he looked at information in a professional context, with still, total attention, and he said, very quietly, "Tell me everything you know." Maya told him. It took 4 minutes. Carter listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "I hear you. Can I get your name and a way to contact you?" She gave him both. He wrote them in a notes app on his phone with a steadiness that told her he was controlling himself very carefully. He thanked her. She walked back to her cart. Her legs felt strange, as though the ground had changed texture while she was standing on it. She did not know that she had just changed the course of 4 people's lives. Carter Weston had spent decades in an industry where the ability to be calm while receiving bad news was not a professional asset but a survival requirement. He had heard things across negotiating tables that were designed to destabilize him. He had received financial reports that described losses significant enough to make less experienced people panic. He had learned, through repetition and necessity, to receive difficult information with the particular stillness of a person who processes before reacting, who separates emotion from action not by suppressing one but by choosing when to allow it. He applied that capacity now to the most personal piece of information he had ever received, and it cost him more than it had ever cost him before. He walked into the room where Diane sat with James and held his son and said the right things. He looked at Diane and said the right things. He drove them home. He put James down in the nursery crib he had assembled himself, in the room that still smelled of fresh paint, and he stood at the railing looking at his son for a long time. Then he walked to his home office, closed the door, and made a phone call. Marcus Webb was a former federal agent who had worked corporate investigations for the past 8 years. Carter had used him once before in a business context and had found him to be methodical, discreet, and constitutionally incapable of softening findings for the comfort of the person paying for them, which was precisely what Carter needed. He told Marcus, in a phone conversation that lasted less than 10 minutes, what he needed to know, and why, and that he needed it done quickly and completely and without a single loose end. Marcus said he understood. He began that same afternoon. Over the following 12 days, Marcus Webb assembled a picture of the previous 9 months of Diane Harlow's activities that was comprehensive and devastating. He traced the financial transfers to the private physician and to the intermediary. He located the online vendors from whom the prosthetic materials and the documentation had been purchased, obtaining records through means that Carter did not inquire about and did not want to know. He identified and made contact with the intermediary, who, when presented with evidence that the arrangement was being scrutinized, made the decision that intermediaries in legal trouble invariably make. He cooperated, in the hope that cooperation would shield him from the worst of what followed. He provided details that filled in the parts of the story that Maya Collins's account had left incomplete. And Marcus found Serena Okafor. She was living in a 1-bedroom apartment in Decatur, a suburb east of Atlanta. She had been there since December, supported by the financial arrangement Diane had made, which had continued to deliver the agreed amounts on schedule. She did not know anything had changed. She was living in a state of quiet grief that she had not yet found language for, the particular grief of a woman who has done something irrevocable for reasons that seemed sound at the time and is now sitting alone on the other side of it, unable to go back, uncertain how to go forward. Marcus explained who he was and why he was there. He asked her to tell him what she knew and what she had been told. Serena told him everything. She confirmed that she had been told the husband was fully aware and consenting. She confirmed the timeline, the arrangements, the specific details of the diner meeting in September where Diane had presented the plan with the smooth confidence of someone offering a solution rather than proposing a transaction. She cried through parts of it. Marcus was professional and patient and treated her with more care than she had expected from someone who had arrived unannounced with questions about the worst thing that had ever happened to her. She asked him directly whether the man, this Carter Weston, whose name she now knew, whether he was going to try to undo everything. Marcus told her honestly that he did not know what Carter intended. What he did know was that Carter Weston had, so far, behaved like a person trying to understand what happened rather than a person looking for someone to punish. Marcus completed his report on a Friday. He delivered it to Carter on a Saturday morning. Carter thanked him, paid the balance of his fee, and told him he would be in touch. He carried the report into his home office, poured himself a glass of water he did not drink, and sat down to read. He read it from the first page to the last without stopping, without moving from his chair, without acknowledging the sound of Diane elsewhere in the house doing ordinary Saturday morning things, the coffee maker, the radio, the low murmur of a phone call to a friend. He read every detail of what had been arranged on his behalf without his knowledge. He read about the physician and the forged documentation and the prosthetics shipped to a post office box Diane had opened under a variant of her name. He read about Serena Okafor, 21 years old, alone in a diner, being offered a way through an impossible situation by a woman who had lied to her as thoroughly as she had lied to him. He read about the birth. He read about the transfer of documents. He read about the specific moment when his son entered the world, which had happened not in the clinic where Carter sat waiting, but in a maternity ward across the city, attended by a hired stranger, while a young woman named Serena cried and tried to be brave and had no one with her to tell her she was doing the right thing, even though she believed she was. He read about Maya Collins, whose account Marcus had formally documented, the corridor, the unlatched door, the January morning when she saw Serena and made the connection, the shift she had traded in order to be at the clinic on the day she believed she might need to be there. Marcus had included a note at the end of her section that was not standard report language. It said simply, "This individual's decision to come forward carries significant personal risk. Her account is consistent, detailed, and I find it credible in every respect." Carter sat with the closed report in his hands for a long time. Outside, the Saturday morning continued. The coffee maker ran through its cycle. Diane laughed at something her friend said. Upstairs, James slept with the complete, undefended trust of a small child who has no reason yet to believe that the world is anything other than safe. Carter thought about his father, who had worked double shifts without complaint. He thought about his mother, who kept everything together on faith. He thought about the house in Savannah that was too small and too loud and completely full. He thought about what it meant to be someone a child could count on, not just financially, not just practically, but in the deepest, most fundamental sense of the word. He thought about what he was going to do. And then he made a decision that was not the easy one, or the obvious one, or the one that most people would have made, but which was, in the fullest sense of the word, the right one. He called his attorney. Before he confronted Diane, before he filed anything, before he made any formal move, Carter drove to Decatur. He found the address from Marcus's report. He sat in the parking lot of Serena Okafor's building for 40 minutes. He was not sure what he intended to say. He was not sure what he was hoping to find. He got out of the car and walked to the door and knocked. Serena opened it. She was smaller than he had imagined from the report, and younger looking, and she had the expression of someone who has been waiting for a knock on the door they were dreading and is relieved, in a strange way, that it has finally arrived. They looked at each other for a moment on the threshold. Carter said, "I just want you to know that none of this was your fault." Serena started crying before he finished the sentence. Not softly, but openly, the way a person cries when they have been holding something very heavy for a long time and someone has just offered to help them put it down. Carter stood there for a moment, then asked if he could come in. She nodded and stepped back. They sat in her small apartment for 2 hours. Carter did not ask accusatory questions. He did not make demands. He did not treat her as a party to what had been done to him. He asked her about herself, her school, her family, her plans before all of this had happened. He asked what she had been told about the arrangement and listened without interruption. He told her, plainly and without softening, what he had learned from the report and what the true situation had been. He watched her face as she understood, for the first time, the full dimension of how she had been deceived, and he did not look away from that. He felt he owed her at least that, the dignity of having someone witness what this had cost her without flinching. Before he left, he told her that he did not know yet how everything would resolve legally or practically, but that he wanted her to know, whatever happened, that the child she had brought into the world was being loved and taken care of, that he was healthy and that his name was James, and that the person raising him was going to make sure he grew up knowing the truth about where he came from. Serena put her hand over her mouth and closed her eyes, and Carter could not tell if she was relieved or devastated, and he suspected it was both, which was the only honest answer to her situation. He drove home. He walked upstairs to the nursery. James was awake, lying in the crib examining the mobile above him with the intense, methodical concentration of a small person encountering the concept of object and color for the first time. Carter leaned over the railing and looked at his son, and his son looked back at him with dark, wide eyes, and Carter said, very quietly, "I'm going to figure this out. I promise you I'm going to figure this out." He waited 3 more days. He needed to have certain things in order legally before the conversation happened, and he needed, if he was being honest with himself, those 3 days to bring himself to a place where he could have it without losing control of it. He was not afraid of Diane. He was not uncertain about what he knew. He simply understood that conversations of this nature, if they dissolved into anger, became about the anger and not about the truth, and Carter needed this conversation to be about the truth. It happened on a Sunday morning at the kitchen table. Diane came downstairs in her weekend routine, coffee, phone, Sunday calm. Carter was already at the table. He had placed Marcus Webb's report in the center of it. When Diane sat down and registered what the document was, something moved across her face, a rapid recalculation, a swift interior assessment of how much he knew and how much she could still manage. She had been doing this her whole life, this immediate read of a situation and identification of her available moves. She looked at the report and then she looked at Carter and she understood, from his absolute stillness and the quality of his silence, that her available moves had been reduced to 1. She did not touch the report. She looked at him. Carter said, "I know everything." She said nothing. He said, "I know about the physician. I know about the documentation. I know about the prosthetics." He paused. "I know about Serena." The last name was the one that broke through whatever composure she had been maintaining. She closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, the calculation was gone. What was there instead was exhaustion. Deep, old, bone-level exhaustion, the kind that accumulates over years of maintaining a performance nobody has asked you to maintain. "I was going to lose you," she said. Her voice was quiet and flat. Carter looked at her. "What? If you knew I couldn't have children, eventually you would have left. I knew what you wanted. I knew it from the beginning. You would have tried to stay, and you would have resented it, and you would have left. And I couldn't." She stopped. She pressed her fingers to her lips for a moment. "I couldn't lose this. I couldn't lose you." Carter sat with that for a long time. He heard it. He understood what it revealed about her fear and about the wound beneath the wound, the deep insecurity that she had never shown him, never trusted him enough to show him, that had driven her to construct this entire edifice of deception rather than simply tell him the truth and see what he chose. He heard all of that. And then he said what he needed to say. "You didn't trust me enough to tell me the truth," he said. "And instead of trusting me, you found a 21-year-old woman who had no power and no support and no one to advise her, and you told her lies so that she would give you her child. And you handed me that child and looked me in the eye and let me fall in love with him based on something that wasn't real." He paused. Whatever you were afraid I would do if you told me the truth, that was a story you told yourself. What you actually did is a fact. And those are very different things. Diane looked at the table. She did not argue. She had no argument. She had nothing left to offer except the truth that had arrived too late, which was that she had been terrified, and had let that terror make her into something she would now spend a long time trying to understand. Carter stood up. He said, "I'm going to need you to leave when you're ready. My attorney will be in contact." He walked upstairs to James's room. He picked up his son. He held him, standing at the nursery window, looking out at the Buckhead Oaks in the gray Sunday morning, for a long time. The divorce was filed in May of 2021. The proceedings were, by the standards of high-asset divorces, relatively uncomplicated, because Diane had very little ground to stand on and knew it, and because Carter's attorney had constructed a case with the kind of documentation that left few reasonable counterarguments available. The settlement was reached without protracted litigation. Diane's attorneys advised her, correctly, that any aggressive legal posture would likely result in a worse outcome than cooperative resolution. She cooperated. She received a settlement that was fair by any objective measure. Carter was not interested in punishment beyond what was necessary and just, and she left the Buckhead house in early June. She left Atlanta entirely by the end of summer. She relocated to a city where her name was unknown and began the long, quiet work of starting over. She was not criminally charged by Carter personally, though the intermediary who had facilitated the arrangement faced investigation for his role in what amounted to an unauthorized private adoption scheme, and the physician who had provided fraudulent documentation lost his medical license following a complaint to the state medical board, a complaint that came from Marcus Webb's report and the documentation it contained. These were consequences, but they were not the totality of consequences. Some things that Diane lost could not appear in any legal record. The life she had spent a decade constructing, the social position, the reputation, the particular kind of visibility that she had prized, was gone. She was known now, in the circles that had regarded her as a success, as a woman who had done a devastating thing. That knowledge traveled faster and further than any court filing. Carter retained full custody of James, and the legal path to that outcome required, among other things, one of the most difficult conversations Carter had ever had in his life. He went back to Decatur. He sat across from Serena Okafor at the same small kitchen table in the same small apartment, and he told her what her legal standing was. He had retained an attorney to advise her independently, someone whose fees Carter paid without making it a condition of anything, because he wanted her to have genuine counsel that was not compromised by obligation to him. He told Serena that the documents she had signed had been obtained under false pretenses and that she had legal grounds to challenge them. He told her that he would not oppose her if she chose to do so. He told her that what he wanted, most of all, was for James to have a life that was built on truth rather than on more lies, and that whatever shape that required, whatever role she wanted to take or not take, he was willing to work toward together. Serena listened to all of it. She asked questions that were careful and practical and that revealed a seriousness of mind that Carter had recognized from their first conversation. She was quiet for a while. Then she said something that Carter has described, in the single occasion on which he has spoken about this period publicly, as one of the most profound things another person has ever said to him in his life. She said, "I want him to be okay more than I want anything else. And I think he is going to be okay with you. So what I want is to know him, as he gets older, in a way that is honest. I don't want to be erased. I don't want him to grow up and find out he has a history that was hidden from him. But I trust you to do this right. I can see that you are trying to do it right." Carter said he was. He meant it, in the way that Carter Weston always meant things. Completely, and with the full understanding that meaning something required you to keep meaning it, day after day, in the small choices and the large ones, over years. Over the months that followed, Carter worked with both his own legal team and the attorney advising Serena to formalize an arrangement that gave Carter primary custody, recognized Serena's biological relationship in the legal record, and established a framework for her role in James's life as he grew older, not as a hidden fact but as a known one, A relationship with a name that James would understand in whatever way a child his age could understand it, and would come to understand more fully. As he grew. It was not a perfect arrangement, because there are no perfect arrangements for situations like this one. But it was an honest one. And in this story, that means everything. Maya Collins had walked back to her supply cart on the day she spoke to Carter and had spent the rest of that shift expecting to be called to a manager's office and dismissed. She went home that evening and waited for the other shoe to drop, the way that people with precarious employment learn to wait, with a braced, low-grade anxiety that becomes its own kind of exhaustion. The call did not come that day. It did not come that week. She went to work and did her job and kept her head down and tried to read nothing into the slight shift in the temperature of the room whenever she entered it. 6 weeks later, she was contacted by Marcus Webb. He identified himself, explained his role in Carter Weston's situation, and asked whether she would be willing to write a formal account of what she had seen and heard and sign it as part of a legal record. He was careful to explain what this might mean for her, that it would create a record of her involvement, that it could not be kept confidential if the matter resulted in formal proceedings. Maya thought about it for 3 days. Then she called him back and said she would do it. She sat at her kitchen table with a legal pad and wrote it out longhand first, then typed it, then printed it and signed it and gave it to a man she had met once, in connection with a situation she had walked into by trading a shift, because she had decided that the version of herself who would do the right thing was the version she intended to be. Shortly after, her shifts were reduced. Then they were eliminated. She applied to 2 other facilities in her field and received no responses. She applied to a third and was told, through a brief and carefully worded email, that the position had been filled. She had been blacklisted, in the quiet, undocumented, entirely deniable way that workplaces blacklist people who cause them trouble. There was nothing to report, nothing to prove, nothing to point at. Just doors that no longer opened. She was struggling, and she said nothing about it to anyone connected to the situation. She did not contact Carter. She did not expect to hear from him. She had done what she had decided to do, and she had accepted that the cost might be significant, and she was absorbing the cost with the same quiet stubbornness with which she had absorbed every hard thing in her life before it. Carter learned about it 4 months later, through a footnote in a follow-up conversation with his attorney who had maintained careful contact with Maya throughout. When he heard what had happened, he was, by his attorney's account, the angriest she had seen him in years of working together. It was not a loud anger. It was a very still, very focused anger, the kind that does not raise its voice because it does not need to. He made a single phone call to the clinic's ownership group. The details of that call were not recorded and were not shared. What followed was that Maya Collins received, within 2 weeks, a formal written apology on clinic letterhead, back payment of wages she was owed for the period of her constructive dismissal, and a professional reference from a senior administrator signed and dated and worded in terms that left nothing to ambiguity. Carter also sent her a letter. He wrote it himself, in his own hand, on personal stationery. Maya has spoken about this letter publicly exactly once, in a brief interview she gave to a community college newsletter about first-generation students navigating professional challenges, and she did not read it aloud or share its specific contents, but she described it as the first time in her adult life that she felt fully seen by someone who had no obligation to see her. She said that after she read it, she sat at her kitchen table for a long time, and then she enrolled in the 4-year program she had been putting off for 2 years because she had not believed she had the standing to attempt it. She is currently in her 3rd year of that program. She still carries the torn strap backpack. She has been asked about it in the one interview she gave, and her answer was simple: it's a reminder of who I was when I made the most important decision of my life. I don't want to forget her. James Weston turned 4 years old this past February. He is, by all accounts, a child of remarkable energy and very specific opinions about the right way to eat breakfast cereal. He has his father's calm focus when something engages him deeply and his biological mother's dark eyes and expressive face. He does not yet fully understand his own story, because he is 4, and 4-year-olds understand mostly that they are loved, fed, and safe, all of which he is in very generous measure. Carter has begun, in small and careful ways, the work of making sure James grows up toward his own story rather than into it unexpectedly. There are board books on his shelf about families that come in different shapes. There are photographs in an album that is accessible rather than hidden, including pictures of a woman James has been introduced to as Miss Serena, who visits twice a year and brings him things and holds him with the particular quality of careful love that belongs to someone who has given something enormous and trusts it to be held well. James accepts her presence with the natural openness of small children, who have not yet learned to be suspicious of love that arrives in unexpected forms. Carter has not yet had the conversation that will need to happen when James is older. He has rehearsed versions of it in his mind without arriving at a version that feels adequate, and has concluded that no version will feel adequate, and that this is not a reason to prepare one less carefully. He has spoken with a family counselor about how to approach it. He has read everything written on the subject of children who learn complex truths about their origins at various ages and the factors that influence how they integrate those truths. He has listened to adults who were adopted, or who discovered unexpected biological information as teenagers or young adults, describe what helped and what did not. He is doing the homework. That is who Carter Weston is. What he knows he will tell James, when the time comes, is this: you came into this world through a set of circumstances that involved people making choices, some of which were wrong and some of which were brave. But every single person in your story loved you. You were wanted with a completeness that very few people get to be wanted with. And you are going to understand your own history with honesty rather than with shame, because honesty is the only ground on which anything real gets built. I want to stop here, before the end, and ask you something directly. Not rhetorically. Actually. If you were Carter Weston, sitting at that kitchen table on a Sunday morning with a 4-month-old son upstairs and a report on the table in front of you that dismantles everything you thought you knew, what do you do? Not what would the right thing be in the abstract. What do you actually do, with love and grief and rage and responsibility all operating in you at the same time, with a child asleep in the room above you who is innocent of all of it and needs you to be capable of functioning? Can you imagine standing in that nursery afterward, holding your son, knowing what you now know, and choosing to keep choosing him? Because Carter did. That was not inevitable. That was a decision, made in real time, with everything it cost. And if you were Serena Okafor, 21 years old, alone, being offered a way through the hardest thing that has ever happened to you, by someone who seems to know the answers and who does not tell you that the answers involve deception, do you sign? Before you say no, think about it honestly. Think about being 21 and frightened and alone and sitting in a diner with someone who has made the math of your situation seem solvable. Think about what it is like to believe you are doing something good and find out later that you were a piece in someone else's plan. How do you come back from that? How do you decide to trust a man you have never met with the child you have already lost, based on one afternoon of conversation and a letter from his attorney? Serena did. That required a kind of courage that is easy to underestimate because it is quiet courage, private courage, the kind that does not announce itself. And if you were Maya Collins, wearing your work uniform, pushing your cart, with everything you have built and everything you still need to build sitting in the balance, do you walk down that corridor? Be honest. Not the version of yourself you aspire to be. The version of yourself that is tired and scared and knows, from experience, what happens to people without power when they make themselves visible by telling the truth. Do you walk? Because Maya did. Not because she was certain it would be fine. Because she decided that the version of herself who walked was the version she could live with. This story is, in its bones, a story about what people do when truth costs something. Diane chose to protect what she wanted at the cost of other people's truth. Carter chose to receive the truth even when it undid his world. Serena chose honesty with a stranger when she had every reason to simply disappear. Maya chose courage when she had every reason to choose safety. None of these choices were made by exceptional people in exceptional circumstances. They were made by ordinary people in real ones. And that is the part that should stay with you. Diane Harlow is in a city she did not grow up in, building a life that is smaller and quieter than the one she had, and working, according to the limited information available, on understanding how she became someone who was capable of what she did. Whether she has made peace with it, whether she has taken genuine responsibility for it, whether the people she hurt have ever received a direct acknowledgement from her, these things are not part of the public record. They may never be. Carter Weston still lives in the Buckhead house. The nursery is no longer a nursery, it has been refitted as a room appropriate for a 4-year-old who has strong opinions about which posters go on which walls. Carter still drives the same kind of car for longer than most people would. He still wears dark coats. He is not, by any report, a man defined by what happened to him. He is a man defined by what he chose to do about it. There is a significant difference between those two things, and it is a difference worth examining in your own life. Serena Okafor completed her nursing degree in 2023. She works in pediatric care in Atlanta. She is, by her own account, good at it. She visits James twice a year. She is not his mother in the full legal sense. She is something for which there is not yet a perfect word, someone who gave him life and trusts someone else to raise it, and who watches from a considered distance as he becomes a person. She has described this, in a private conversation that was later shared with permission, as the most painful and the most meaningful thing in her life simultaneously. Maya Collins is in her 3rd year of a 4-year healthcare administration program. She works part-time in a clinic, a different clinic, where her supervisor values her quietly and with specificity. She still carries the backpack. She does not talk about what happened often. When she does, she says only that she is glad she walked down that corridor, and that she wishes it had not cost what it cost, but that she would do it again. Every time. Without hesitation. James is 4 years old. He does not know yet that his life is one of the most complete and moving stories about what truth can cost and what it can build when people choose it. He just knows that his dad always comes when he calls. That his dad knows exactly how to assemble furniture without instructions, or at least is willing to laugh at himself while figuring it out. That there is a woman named Serena who smells like something warm and holds him carefully. That his name is James, and he is loved. And there is a woman named Maya who has a torn strap on her backpack and a degree she is finishing one class at a time, who he will probably never meet, who made a decision in a corridor one February morning that changed his story before his story had barely begun. He will know about her too, someday, when he is old enough to understand what it means that a stranger chose to be brave on his behalf. Carter will make sure of that. Because the truth is not a comfortable thing to choose. It is not always the thing that keeps you safe or keeps you employed or keeps the life you have built intact. But it is the only thing that, when you stand at the end of everything and look back at who you were, you can say you did not betray. And in a world that offers 1,000 reasons every single day to look away, to stay quiet, to tell yourself it is not your problem and it is not your place and someone else will handle it, in that world, the people who choose truth anyway are the rarest and most necessary kind of person. We do not always know who they are. They do not always wear it visibly. Sometimes they are wearing a work uniform and pushing a supply cart. Sometimes they are 21 and alone and frightened. Sometimes they are sitting in a home office at 42 on a Saturday afternoon holding a report that changes everything and deciding what kind of man they intend to be. They are all around us. And sometimes, if we are paying attention, we get to see what happens when they choose well. I want to ask you one final question, and I want you to sit with it rather than scroll past it. Who in your life right now is holding a truth they have not yet found the courage to speak? And are you the kind of person, not in theory, but in practice, today, in the actual circumstances of your actual life, who makes it easier for them to speak it? Are you someone people trust with hard things? Are you Carter at the table, still and receptive? Are you the person who, when the courage of someone smaller than you changes your world, makes sure they are not destroyed for it? That is the question this story leaves us with. It is not about Diane. Diane is a warning, not a lesson. The lesson is Carter. The lesson is Serena. The lesson is Maya Collins walking down a corridor with shaking hands because she decided that who she wanted to be was more important than what she was afraid to lose. Thank you for staying with this story all the way to the end. If it moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Drop a comment below telling us which person in this story you connected with the most, and why. Was it Carter and the impossible weight of what he discovered? Was it Serena, young and alone and trying to do right by a child in an impossible situation? Was it Maya, invisible in a corridor, making a decision that cost her everything and gave her everything? Tell us. We read every single comment, and your perspective matters. And if you are new here, click subscribe right now so that you never miss a story like this one. We will see you in the next one.